So welcome back again. Trying to keep it to 30-ish minutes. I had to do some broad categories. There's a lot we could talk about. If what I say doesn't get to the level of specifics of your questions, we have Q&A. But it was tricky to figure out what to say and what not to say in 30 minutes. But here we go. The first thing, I advanced on my own slide without signaling to the... The first question I want to tackle is this question of church teaching. Male and female, he created them. This is the claim in Scripture. It's also basic biology. The human species is a sexually dimorphic species. There is male and female. There are what are often called intersex conditions, sometimes called disorders of sexual development, or DSDs. These can serve as a kind of smoke screen. People will say, so watch this, right? Generally speaking, men have an XY chromosome pairing and women have an XX chromosome pairing. But it's actually possible to have women with an XY or men with an XX. That's possible. Now, does that prove that the human species is not sexually dimorphic? Well, actually, if you think about it, if you can identify this person who has XX chromosomes as a male, you know exactly what a male is, right? The chromosomes are a good rule of thumb. They're not absolute. All kinds of things happen on chromosomes. You might have the gene in question, but it's not turned on. That's one of the things that can happen. There's lots of things that can happen. The point is, in every single case with these ambiguities, we can actually tell. There are some cases where you could tell in theory, but in practice, you may or may not be able to, given your technical or whatever capacity. But in theory, we know actually what makes someone male or female from a biological point of view. A male produces a small gamete. A female produces a large gamete. Every human body is ordered towards the production of one or the other. There are very rare cases of people who have a combination of ovary and testicular tissue. That's a very, very, very rare case. But we don't have any person who has then demonstrated the capacity to father and mother a child with that tissue. One dominates over the other. Lots of these people are infertile. Infertility does not make you not male or female, whether there's an intersex condition or not. Infertility is not determinative of masculinity or femininity. The intersex question, one of the very first question we got is are there biological markers for gender identities? Well, by definition, no, because any biological marker you could find would be overruled. On the other hand, there are ambiguities in intersex conditions where, which are not the same thing as a trans claim, though an individual with an intersex condition may choose to identify as trans, right? And so then you would have both these things coinciding, and that kind of muddies the waters. But the important thing to remember is the biological ambiguity is the intersex claim. The trans, not claim, the intersex condition. The trans claim is an extra layer on top of that may or may not have been made, right? But that's a personal decision. You say, I see this cultural category. I think for whatever reason it helps me make sense of myself. I choose that identity. But by definition, the trans identity is chosen. It's a self-identification. It's not a biological condition. The intersex question is used to muddy the waters. You say, well, sex isn't so binary as you think. Therefore, the trans claim is the coherent claim. But it's the opposite. The intersex claim says there is biological ambiguity, and the trans claim says biological ambiguity is irrelevant. Whether it's there or not doesn't actually shape this. So it's a shell game, right? To try to do that. Now, it is important, however, to recognize that within the human family, there are people who are ambiguous in their bodies in terms of their presentation and all that kind of stuff. And while at a scientific level, you can identify everything, at least in theory, as male or female, there's just nothing wrong with like a huge range of biological or even cultural whatever expression, right? That some men like ballet and some women can grow beards and like all of that, like that's fine. It's just fine. Like there's just nothing wrong with it. And part of the problem where we collaborate with certain gender ideology is to pathologize variation within the sexes, right? If we say you're not a healthy man if you prefer ballet to football or whatever, well then we're doubling down on the stereotypes that these things rely on. If there's no biological root, then the only criteria are stereotypes. So the last thing we want to do is double down on the stereotypes, right? That's a certain kind of conservative reaction to this kind of stuff is, well, no, men will be men and women will be women. And sometimes, I mean, we certainly want to give men and women a healthy sense of masculinity and femininity. That needs to be broad-minded enough to account for natural human variation that does not pathologize just normal differences of interest, or even just, a woman who's tall and muscular and has a strong jawline. She might not have an intersex condition, but she might just look a little masculine. And a guy who's kind of slight and has a higher voice, and like, whatever. Like it's just, all of that is normal and fine. And we should be very clear that we don't identify masculinity and femininity with stereotypes. That's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Unity of body and soul, right? In the Catholic vision of the human person, the soul is the form of the body. These are not two things that get cobbled together kind of by accident. And that could exist independently, right? So before the resurrection of the body, you are radically incomplete, right? Your soul is in heaven, but your body rots in the ground. That's not Christianity, right? The soul is not the eternal principle that's the real you, and the body is the historical accident. That is not Christianity, even though I've even been at Catholic funerals where I've heard a priest say, their soul goes to heaven and their body rots in the ground. Like, no, we believe in the resurrection of the body. And so, because the soul does not pre-exist the body, right? We don't believe in pre-existing souls that get sent. There's that Disney cartoon about the jazz pianist, where there's these pre-existing souls that get sent into different bodies and they can sort of transmogrify. For a little while, he ends up with a cat and, all this kind of stuff, right? Well, that's a different conception of the human person. And within that conception, you could say, my soul is in the wrong body, right? And so I had a young person who was dealing with gender issues. They also actually had an intersex condition. But they wondered if that was a Catholic way of making sense of their experience was my soul put in the wrong body? And that's just not what we think a soul is. A soul is integrally related to the body. It's not something accidentally added to this body that might have been added to another body. Now, notice this experience of disconnection with your body is real. People have that experience. They're trying for a category to make sense of their experience. They've heard of souls, they've heard of bodies. They might even, as the case was with this young person who talked to me, be trying to make sense of it within Orthodox Catholic lenses. They wanted to think of what was happening in their experience in terms of body and soul, so then maybe God put this soul in the wrong body. Now notice one big problem here is then you're a mistake, right? And you're a mistake that needs fixing. And no matter what you do, you can never actually finally fix that thing. This is one of the experiences of people who transition medically is, I'll feel better when. And then they get one level of surgery, and then, no, that didn't do it, and I'll feel better when, and I'll feel better when. And then you look in the mirror and you say, okay, my voice is cracking and I have a beard that I'll never get rid of, and this didn't solve my problem. If you know the story of the young woman who sued the National Health Services in Britain, and they radically reevaluated how they treat gender dysphoria in light of her winning her court case. That was her experience. She was like, this is going to fix it. Oh, no, it didn't. Oh, no, it didn't, right? But the fundamental problem, and this is where we have good news, people. You are prophets of the good news. You're not a mistake. That's it, right? That's born in the wrong body implies that there's an error at the heart of the person that you actually can't fix despite all your best efforts. A rush to affirm and then to try to fix it actually affirms that you're a mistake. Despite all your best intention, you've doubled down on the idea that someone is a mistake, that there's something wrong at the heart of them. And we get to say, actually, no, your body is good. God didn't make a mistake. You are good. Your body is good. That is good news that some people are literally dying to hear, and that we have it. God created you good. This goes to your question, Father, from the last session. Sex and gender. So Pope Francis mentions in Amoris Laetitia that we can distinguish between sex and gender, but never separate them. So they're not the same thing. It's actually useful to have these two categories. Sex as a biological category, that we discussed at the beginning, right? You're male or female biologically, even with disorders of sexual development. At least theoretically, we can tell if you're male or female by which gamete your body is ordered to produce. That's one kind of thing. Gender is a confusing term culturally because it gets used for a bunch of different things. The person I would recommend you on this and on this whole topic, Abigail Favale, has written a book called The Genesis of Gender, and she's written wonderful things on Church Life Journal and other places on the internet. She's got a great video series. She's been interviewed on numerous podcasts. Abigail Favale is the best I know on this. She was a gender studies professor who became a Catholic. And she's very clear. And one of the things she does is she talks about how gender gets used in multiple ways, many of which are actually mutually exclusive and contradictory. So it's deeply confusing. Abigail Favale, F-A-V-A-L-E. But in general, we can say gender is a useful category for distinguishing between our biological sex and, on the one hand, our culture's ideas and expectations around how we live out our sexed body, right? Male and female relationships, all that kind of thing. Presentation, expression, all that kind of stuff. And so there's the cultural level, and then there's the personal level, which is my experience of living in my sexed body, right? And that's a different thing than my sexed body itself, right? And so it's worth distinguishing and having this category. And given the conditions we looked at in the first talk, it is not surprising that young people in particular are struggling with their experience of their sexed body, right? So they're struggling with gender identity. That's a thing that really happens. And with their culture's expectation, what it means to be male, what it means to be female, how to relate to people of the same sex, how to relate to people of the opposite sex. As your example pointed out, Father, how to relate to people who are identifying as something other than their own sex. And now, am I gay if I'm with a biological man, but that biological man doesn't identify as a man? It gets very messy, right? How do we understand ourselves in light of those things? So we can distinguish gender from sex, but Pope Francis says, but we can't separate them. It does not make sense to say that my gender is different from or in competition with my biological sex, right? So this is where the Catholic attitude, and Francis says this in Amoris Laetitia too, there's a massive healthy range of living as a biological male that can include a whole range of interests, a whole bunch of different body types, a whole bunch of, culturally ways of dressing, like all these kinds of things. But if they start to undermine some things which need to be biological, two really obvious ones, the formation of a family is rooted in the biological distinction between male and female. So if some cultural norm or whatever around gender starts to muddy the water around what makes a family, all those kinds of things, which is what we've seen in our culture, well, that's a separation that is unhealthy. Here's a really interesting one, which is actually, if I had given this talk 5 years ago, I wouldn't have noted this, but the single most important place where the average person who's like, I just want to affirm everyone and accept everyone, has started to push back against gender ideology is women's sports. That has been a major turning point culturally. Is people have seen videos of biological men crushing women on a rugby field, spiking volleyballs in women's faces, mixed martial arts, including this one mixed martial artist who uses explicitly misogynist language about beating up women, and then identifies as a woman and breaks their bones in a mixed martial arts context. This is a place where the culture has said, okay, something has gone too far. And I think it's an example of where a distinction between sex and gender has become a separation and then allowed for something that is profoundly unhealthy, so that the average person says that can't be right. I think there's other examples here, but let me notice that cultures have had different ways of talking about people who don't fit who are atypical in their gender presentation. And like we talked about tomboys earlier on, right? Like just nothing wrong with a category like a tomboy that doesn't pathologize, but recognizes that this person is atypical for their sex in terms of their gender presentation. If you grew up like I did, we had a very healthy category for women who were atypical of their sex. It was tomboys. We didn't have any category like that for boys who were atypical, right? And that was actually a real tragedy, that there were boys who were atypical of their sex, but every category we had for those boys was pathological, right? And so the girl who was atypical could be socially, quite well integrated with her cohort, and the boy who was atypical could not be socially well integrated. So, as Catholics, we're not against categories that recognize atypical gender expression in a way that's non-pathological. In fact, I think we would say it would have been really good if there was an equivalent of tomboy for those boys. There would have been nothing wrong with that. But notice what those categories didn't do. They didn't say that she wasn't really a girl. They didn't say she wouldn't grow up and marry a man and have a family. They didn't say she shouldn't compete against the girls in the sports. They didn't say any of those things, right? They just recognized she was atypical in a non-pathological way. That's fine. And so there are cultures we may encounter in a Canadian context, Indigenous language of two-spirited. Now I worry that language is co-opted by what Pope Francis called neo-colonialism and is used to say not what Indigenous communities have historically said, but becomes a sort of Indigenous approved way of saying what contemporary gender ideology is saying, right? So they kind of import this category and say, look, gender ideology is in all these different cultural contexts. From what I can see, the indigenous communities and their historical way of talking about this was mostly a healthy way of recognizing atypical gender expression. There are some men who are not stereotypically masculine and some women who are not stereotypically feminine, and that's cool. There are examples. This is quite typical. It happened in indigenous cultures in North America. There's very famous examples in India, for example, where there are what are called third genders. Sometimes we're told that this is very progressive. Notice how this works. If you believe that there are two genders, you are very narrow-minded because some cultures believe that there are three. No one ever says, you're from a culture that believes there are three genders, but you're very narrow-minded because there are some cultures that believe that there are four. Right? Notice how that works. The third gender can be a healthy thing. Tomboy would be an example. We never called it a third gender. But effeminate men, historically, across many cultures, have been recognized as a third gender and then sexually exploited. It's very, very common. Most of these third genders in India, which we're told this is a beautiful, open-minded thing, they're mostly prostitutes. Well, this is not uplifting of human dignity, right? Just because they recognize a third gender doesn't mean they're open-minded. We don't want to follow something that says, yes, and now you can live in a brothel and, so there are, I guess the big picture is, as Catholics, we can be open-minded about cultural categories that try to make sense of people having an atypical experience. It's not automatically bad and wrong. That distinction is legit. That doesn't mean that every way that it's done upholds human dignity and reflects human experience, right? So it's a case-by-case question. Is this a healthy way of describing this or not? All right, and my last one, moral questions about transitioning, right? Transitioning is a very broad there's lots of ways people can transition, right? People can cut their hair and wear different clothes, and that can be part of social transitioning. Well, the church doesn't really have any teaching at all about how long your hair should be or what clothes you should wear. We might be concerned that you've been taken in by an ideology that in the long term is going to lead to other things that are bad. But if you're more comfortable with short hair, that's cool, right? There can be asking for people to refer to you differently in terms of a name or a pronoun. We'll talk more about that in the pastoral session, but that's a kind of social transition. Then there's medical kinds of transitions. The first thing often recommended for prepubescent children is hormone blockers. We will be told that these are 100% reversible. That is based on a circumstance that does not apply. That, if someone tells you they're 100% reversible, that is because these drugs were often used to treat precocious puberty. Young girl starts showing signs that she's approaching menarche when she's 8. You put her on a hormone blocker till she's 12 or 13. You take her off, she goes through puberty normally. 100% reversible in that use case. Someone's approaching puberty at a normal time, 12 or 13, you give them a hormone blocker. It is not 100% reversible in that context. We know a lot about what happens. Brain development, bone development, all kinds of things. Not reversible in those regards. But when put in a social context where the next step is cross-sex hormones, then regardless of whether it was theoretically reversible, in practice it almost never is, because over 90% of young people you put on puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormones, because the number one thing that resolves gender confusion in prepubescent children is puberty. So if you take puberty away, you're not letting them, you give them time to figure it out. You're taking away the number one, treatment's not even the right word. It's not even a treatment. The number one resolution of their situation is now off the table, and they're, again, ex nihilo. They're out there floating in the ether with nothing, and they're supposed to make a decision based on who knows what, because you've taken away the natural, the given, the human experience, right? Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones. So, from a Catholic medical standpoint, well, there are times when puberty blockers are recommended. Precocious puberty, for example. This use is not justified in Catholic medical ethics. Cross-sex hormones, same thing. There are times and circumstances when, as a medical intervention, those can make sense depending on a person's, what's the word I want? I mean, people have hormone imbalances. It's a medical thing that happens, right? This use case is not justified. And then the next question is surgeries, right? And so there are a variety of surgeries. What is often called top surgery is the removal of breast tissue. Bottom surgery is penectomy, so removal of the penis, and vaginoplasty, or the reverse, right? A very invasive, lots of complications, not great outcomes. This does not mean that no individual has ever had an outcome that they are happy with. It doesn't mean that. That there's a wide range of human experience. In general, these treatments do not do better than other options for people facing these kinds of questions. But what they tend to do, and this is my subtitle, what they tend to do is double down on stereotypes, right? So we say on the one hand, things like secondary sex characteristics like your jawline or the depth or height of your voice or your body hair or whatever, of course, those don't determine sexuality, right? But what do you need to do to affirm your sex? You need the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex. So you double down on secondary sex characteristics surgically when ideologically you say, well, those actually aren't. So they are determinative and they're not determinative at the same time, which will, of course, in general, and again, individual cases are individual cases. And when the person shows up in your office, they're an individual case, and you don't just tell them that their experience isn't their experience because the theologian said in general, right? So let's remember that. But in general, these are not high-quality medical interventions that lead to resolutions that satisfy people, right? And very often they lead to deep regret. One of the things that you'll hear is activists will say if they don't transition, they're going to kill themselves, right? Which is a form of blackmail. First of all, it's actually not the case. The relationship between suicidality and these interventions is quite fraught, and in many cases, suicidality can increase after these interventions. You can never run the experiment twice, right? Someone gets the intervention and they commit suicide. You say, well, I guess they shouldn't have. Someone doesn't run the intervention and they commit suicide. I guess they should have. You don't know. You don't know. And it's ugly and messy. But what we do know is, as a general rule, this does not help. And so we want to look for other things that do help, that start from people need, we're not psychologists, we need to let the professionals do what the professionals do if they are in fact doing the right thing. You want to find good psychologists that you can work with. But what we can do as pastors and pastoral counselors is affirm their goodness of their body. You're not a mistake. God made a wide range of people. Your experiences, there's lots of factors in history, things in your family, things in your culture, and it's a shame that people have to experience hard things. Sometimes it's going to be abuse. Sometimes it's going to be early exposure to things like pornography or just bad ideas about the human person. And we're going to be cleaning up, the mess of that. But you're not a mistake. You are good. And I'm going into the next talk already, right? To uphold don't push someone to try to perform as a gender that they don't feel comfortable with. That is generally not healthy. Let them lead, right? This is a very simple one, right? A boy who never learned how to throw or catch a ball doesn't feel like much of a man because he can't throw and catch a ball. Well, one bad thing you can do is say, we're going to make you throw and catch a ball and then you'll be a man. And then all their attempts that feel weak and fraught and inadequate are just going to make it worse. And on the other hand, providing a context in which they can freely explore things that would make them feel more at home in their bodies, which may at their initiative include throwing and catching a ball, could be absolutely great. The exact same action, but a completely different, right? If you say you must do this to be a man, right? And so fathers who have an effeminate son who are like, you're going to play football or whatever, that's not going to help. But the grown man who's like, I would like to be more in touch with my masculine side, would you play catch with me? Can be very healing. You see, this is the very same action with a different attitude, right? But the point is, we're not doubling down and forcing on things like stereotypes, because if he wants to paint watercolors, let's do it. Like that's great, right? Okay. There's probably a lot of other questions here. Like I said, in 30 minutes, I'm trying to get big picture categories that allow us the possibility to explore particular questions in the Q&A. So we're at about the 30-minute mark, so we can move to that after we take a 4-second pause.